Let's take a look at this wireless home lighting e-commerce brand making $1,210,000 per year in profit and recently listed for sale at an asking price of $3,650,000. That is a little more than a 3x valuation multiple. In this video, I'm going to go through this listing and cover some of the key details and things that you should consider if you're interested in acquiring this business, some of the things you'd want to flesh out before making an offer on the business, and ultimately my quick take on the business's valuation and other general insight from my own experience acquiring, operating, and selling online businesses. All right, so let's jump into it. First thing I got to say is that even though there are some highlights in here, I completely don't know what I highlighted because I actually highlighted this like 3 days ago and then left the browser window open. And I was just closing out all of my windows and I ran across this one. I'm like, oh, hey, I didn't do a video on this. Let me do it. So I actually forget the details of this listing. Anyhow, let's just start at the top here. It was established in 2021. They've got multiple sales channels, 130,000 email subs, $130 average order value. It is a wireless home lighting brand built around a uniquely crafted patent-pending wall sconce that solves a universal homeowner problem. It's a category leader. Effortless installation on their products with no wiring, drilling, or handyman required. The result is a high decor product that looks like it belongs in a luxury interior magazine, but installs in seconds. So I'm thinking it's like stick-on or something. Their hero product delivers a clean, minimalist silhouette, premium materials, a rechargeable bulb system, and an intuitive remote control functionality. Customers rave about how it transforms hallways, bedrooms, and entryways. They've gotten exceptional demand across the US and UK, consistently generating 6,000 to 10,000 monthly orders. It runs with a lean, well-orchestrated direct-to-consumer engine with a remote team and reliable overseas 3PL. They've got a bunch of email and SMS subscribers, strong social media, and a 2 to 3% return rate. They've got a loyal audience. They've got a core demographic, a 70% gross margin, and a $130 AOV. And the founder was able to negotiate vendor terms with 0 upfront payments and 30-day window, creating a cash flow friendly structure that is exceptionally attractive to a buyer. Let me just reread that whole thing. The founder's ability to negotiate vendor terms with 0 upfront payments and 30-day windows, creating a cash flow friendly structure that is exceptionally attractive. So I'm taking that as the seller does not have to pay for inventory upfront when they order it. I don't know if I don't know when they have to pay for it. It doesn't say that, but they don't have to pay it upfront to make an order. So they have some time to actually move the inventory and generate cash flow. Enabling the founders to work just 2 to 3 days per week. Okay, so there's multiple founders here. Intellectual property is under the cornerstone with a pending design patent and a trademark. And the business is, having explosive growth, but still early in its trajectory, okay? A lot of good details there, but before we jump into any of those, let's look at the revenue and EBITDA number. It's doing $13,746,000 in revenue. EBITDA, $1,210,000. Just doing the quick math on that, that is like a 9% margin. That is a pretty tight margin. It's not absolutely, rock bottom for an e-commerce business. I have seen large e-commerce businesses thrive with, about that margin or even a little bit lower. But that said, that is a relatively low margin e-commerce business. You can find e-commerce businesses for sale that have a much higher margin doing at least this or more in profitability. All right, so 9% margin. And I guess if it's not implied, I'm not a big fan of that. But let's just go down here to where they said they had a 70% gross margin. All right, so 70% gross margin. So after cost of goods and fulfilling the order, they've got 70% gross margin. But ultimately, the business is only churning off 9% to the bottom line. What that's telling me is that this business is heavily dependent on direct response marketing. In some way, they are running ads, spending a ton of money on ads, and if we math that out, that's 61% of their of their revenue, roughly, because this business isn't likely to have many other costs, but a very high percentage, nearly all of their other money that is not cost of goods or profitability is going to advertising. So they are aggressively spending money on ads to keep the sales coming. All right, so 9% margin, aggressively spending money on ads. Let's just go back here and flesh out these details. They've got some type of patent pending on their lights, but we don't know how valuable that patent really is, because some patents, and I think they said design or utility patents somewhere in here, but some patents, even utility patents, can be easily snaked around, right? You can achieve fundamentally the same thing, just in a different way, and that effectively makes the patent not as valuable, and ultimately your offer here or product not as valuable. If I were considering buying this business here, I would really want to make sure I understand this patent and have a solid idea of just how easy or difficult it would be to work around it to really understand the value of the patent. The product, per business listing, they make it seem like the product's good, but you'd ultimately want to flesh that out. They have a hero product, so that means all of their sales are concentrated, or their sales, I shouldn't say all of their sales are concentrated, but their sales in general are concentrated towards one product that is really propelling this revenue here. They've got an overseas 3PL that I'm not really sure what to make of the overseas, but I think that makes it easier to fulfill orders globally, but ultimately takes longer to fulfill orders in the United States or get orders delivered in the US. I've got mixed feelings on the overseas 3PL. 2 to 3% return rate, relatively low, and it's nice to see that you have that return rate established, particularly with this revenue, and I would want to make sure that indeed that return rate is correct. The vendor terms seem like a good thing, but I don't really think there's a ton of value behind that. It's nice when the business has such a low margin as it does to not have to fund inventory up front and kind of, prolong or pull back your cash flow cycle with the vendor terms. But again, not a huge value add. Now, founders, the business says founders. You've got two founders working in the week. Two founders working in the business, and they say work just 2 to 3 days per week. I always take this with a grain of salt, unless you can clearly see that the business has a robust employee base behind it. I would estimate that there's the founders working full-time in this business and consider that the case, unless you can really prove otherwise. Patent pending. The pending design patent, okay, so they don't have a utility patent. That all just kind of ties back into what I was saying about the patent. And then the business is still early in its trajectory. Yes and no. It's not a very old business, but at the same time, there's clearly a very skilled marketer behind this business who has been spending millions of dollars a year running ads to an audience. And what, in my experience, typically happens when you get a business that is, really had accelerated growth through direct response marketing is you get to a point where you kind of exploit that audience. You haven't built out a brand so much, you haven't built out much organic activity that happens, and you're just hammering the ads. When you first find that audience offer fit, everything feels really, really successful because the audience has not seen the offer before, and you're capturing all the people that just have kind of pent-up demand for it. But as you continue running ads, you exploit that audience and you exploit that pent-up demand for whatever your offer is. So the return on ad spend tends to diminish. And I'm sure if we looked at the financials and the amount of advertising spend and revenue, you would see a declining return on ad spend at some point. I don't know that for sure, but I would be willing to bet on that if I were a gambling man. So it's always something to consider. So going back to the point here, early in its trajectory, you don't really know what the trajectory of the product is, but given the context of an experienced advertiser spending a lot of money on ads, I think anybody's going to have a hard time maintaining this ad performance, yet alone doing any better. So if I were interested in growing it, I would make sure that there was a plan to really pull in sales from the email, and maybe that's already, happening as well. But this would be very hard for somebody that is not an experienced advertiser. By experience, I mean experience selling e-commerce products with an advertising budget in the millions of dollars a year. I mean, like, you look at this and you assume that just 50% of their revenue is going to ads. That's 7.35 and change $1 million a year in advertising spend that this business is likely doing. This is very high level in advertising here, unless I'm completely missing something. But given the other context of the listing, I am willing to bet that a substantial portion of the difference between the gross margin and net margin is going to ads. So on that note, what is my take on this business's valuation? Is it worth the 3x multiple here? So let me just kind of give you the context here, the short and sweet of how I'm seeing. We've got a hero product business. We've got a design patent pending, not a utility patent. And in my experience, it's not entirely difficult to get around the patent, or to get around a design patent, I should say. They're spending a lot of money on ads to one hero product, and they've got low margins here. And subsequently, with the spending a lot of money on ads, there's clearly a skilled marketer in there that your chances of being better than are slim to none. And I also don't see a lot of brand value in this business, considering the assumed advertising spend and the low margin. I think that assigning a valuation to this business unit, a 3x would be on the high side. The buyer pool for something like this is very, very limited. It would need to be somebody that's experienced running e-commerce brands, somebody that has the ability to really add new products to it, because you'd have to assume that the market is maybe exploited for this product that they have, at least from an advertising perspective. So maybe an e-commerce brand already that has something they think they could cross-sell to it. Yeah, I don't see, at this revenue, I don't see any way that the cost of goods sold is going to get any lower. I think that there's just, I don't know how to say it, but I just see this as being a tough business to grow, and I see one that is questionable on sustainability. So the buyer pool for this is limited. Certainly not something you'd want to get into if you have no experience running an e-commerce business and you're looking to acquire a robust and sustainable asset that you can kind of get comfortable in the driver's seat of and run for some time without making any substantial changes. If this, in my opinion, if this trades, it's likely to be to somebody that's already experienced in the e-commerce space and maybe be at a 2x valuation multiple. If not, be structured some way substantially leaning towards an earnout based on the profitability going forward. This one just seems tough to transact on unless you really have some unique angle. And subsequently, I think the valuation multiple, like I said, would be in that kind of 2x range, maybe 2.5x. At a 3x valuation, I think it is valued on the very, very, very high side of fair. And personally speaking, I would not advise anyone to acquire this business at that multiple unless you are experienced and have a skilled path forward for growing it. Now, one other thing I want to point out here before we wind down, and actually before I point that out, let me just say this. If you found this video helpful or insightful, smash that like button to help me out in the YouTube algorithm. And if you feel like there's anything I've missed out on or overlooked in this business listing, or you have a different take on this business's valuation, let me know in the comments below. Now, what I wanted to point out was the valuation multiple assigned to the future profitability as we would forecast it to arrive at what would be a fair value to acquire it. Okay, so the valuation here is based on how it has performed over likely the last 12 months. They didn't give us the period, but I'm going to assume 12 months. As a buyer, what this business is worth to you is what it's going to perform or how it's going to perform under your ownership. So aside from adjusting for any expenses that you may incur or may not have if you acquire the business, you have to consider the trend of revenue. And we don't know what the trend of the revenue is. It doesn't say that other than it's having explosive growth. But if indeed the revenue is growing, you would forecast that out over the profitability in the future 12 months. Let's just say that we could assume the revenue is growing at 10%. It made $1,210,000 last year. I'm going to forecast it out to be $1,331,000 next year. You would assign, or I would assign, the valuation multiple to this to arrive at the valuation that I would offer for the business. Now, this scenario did forecast growth. So if we say it's, worth, let's just be generous and say 2.5 valuation multiple on that, a fair valuation would be $3.3 million. But at the same time, if it's declining, we do that $1,210,000, declining at 10% a year, well, then the number suddenly changes here. That's $1,089,000 times 2.5, $2,700,000. Always consider what the future 12 months is going to look like after you acquire the business. And, they say this is having explosive growth. Always consider when something's having explosive growth, as fast as it explodes upwards, it can crash down. So I don't weight explosive growth very heavily. Steady and stable growth, right? 10% in a year, 15, maybe even 20%. If you're seeing that trend year over year, that is something favorable and worth considering. When you see explosive growth, right? If this thing's growing 50% year over year, you can't really value on that because that is simply not sustainable. Subsequently, if the business is just stable but hasn't grown year over year, I think it's fair to factor in maybe a 5% decline for the future 12 months. And with that, if the business is in a decline, assume that the decline is going to decline faster than the steady rate of decline. It's a whole lot of context there, but the key point is always consider what the business is going to do over the next 12 months. Consider your expenses. I didn't really talk much about that, but consider the expenses that you may also incur as the buyer that the seller may not have had. On the flip side, you can consider expenses you may not have, right? If you have a hosting account already, you don't have to pay for hosting. That's at a simple level for the business. That impacts its profitability. But then if you sell it, somebody else will have to pay hosting. So yeah, consider the expenses you're going to incur and the trend of the revenue to forecast what the profitability is going to be, what's ultimately going to come into your pocket, and assign the valuation multiple to that. On that note, guys, I'm calling it a wrap and signing off. Again, if you found this video helpful and insightful, you know the drill. Smash that like button to help me out in the YouTube algorithm. I'm calling it a wrap and signing off on that note.